Hi, welcome to Mrs. Long's video lesson on the Picture of Dorian Gray. Today we're going to be looking at chapter 4 in a little bit more detail. So in chapter 4, the setting is Lord Henry's home, and it's a month after Dorian and Lord Henry first met, and Dorian is sitting waiting for Lord Henry to arrive. Lord Henry is not home yet. He meets Lord Henry's wife, which is quite an interesting interaction. And then it we end off the chapter with the news of Dorian's engagement to Sybil Vane, which he spends most of the chapter telling Lord Henry about. Okay, so as Dorian is sitting in Lord Henry's sitting room, there's this long description of all the beautiful decorations around this room. And we already know that Lord Henry is a person who has a very special interest in surrounding himself with beautiful things. Okay, so his home is very elaborately decorated. Now, he hasn't arrived yet, and we see there that the narrator tells us he is always late on principle. His principle being that punctuality is the thief of time, which of course it's a thief of time to the person who is trying to hold himself to be punctual, but the person who's waiting is having their time wasted as well. Gives you insight into Lord Henry's self-centered ways. The lad was looking rather sulky. Obviously, Dorian doesn't like to be kept waiting either. Most of us don't. And as he's waiting, Lord Henry's wife arrives. And when I first read the novel, I took such interest and such pleasure in observing this interaction and looking at the narrator's description of Lord Henry's wife, because she's not at all what you would expect it. Lord Henry comes across as very refined. He's got all of these dazzling ideas about beauty and the nature of life. And yet he's married to this really curious woman, as she's described here, whose dresses always looked as if they'd been designed in a rage and put on in a tempest. So she's not particularly well put together, and she kind of she's not refined and classically beautiful as you would expect Lord Henry to have picked for his life partner. Now he says when she sees Dorian, she says, "I know you quite well by your photographs. I think my husband has got 17 of them." Interesting. Lord Henry has surrounded himself with photographs of Dorian. Read into that what you will. And then we're also told that she's usually in love with somebody, and as her passion was never returned, she'd kept all her illusions. Okay, so she'd never had her heart broken, and so her sort of enchantment with being in love with somebody carried on. Her name was Victoria, and she had a perfect mania for going to church. Again, quite a disparate view to what we have of Lord Henry. He doesn't seem to be particularly religious. In fact, a lot of his ideas fly directly in the face of Victorian religion. It's actually interesting as well that her name is Victoria, seen as this is set in the Victorian period. I wonder if that was deliberate on the part of Oscar Wilde. Then they seem to find a point of common interest. She talks about how she loves music, and they both love music. And Dorian says to her, if one hears bad music, it's one's duty to drown it in conversation. So he says he never talks during good music. Now, Lady Henry, Victoria says, that's one of Harry's views, isn't it, Mr. Gray? I can always hear Harry's views from his friends. It's the only way I get to know of them. So she recognizes her husband's voice coming through somebody else. And there's also the mention there, I think, of the fact that she and her husband obviously don't talk a lot because she only hears of what he thinks from other people's observations. And then she leaves just after Lord Henry arrives. So Lord Henry's excuse for being late was he was looking for a piece of brocade, which is elaborately decorated fabric. He says nowadays people know the price of everything and the value of nothing, which is something that's persisted nowadays. It's actually quite a common idiom to say that. People are more interested in something's physical value than the inherent quality that it holds. So she bids them goodbye and she says, you're dining out, I suppose. Perhaps I shall see you. And she flits out of the room like a bird of paradise that has been out all night in the rain. So again, this idea that she's not very well put together, not this refined, gentle woman. But we also see that they might end up at the same place, but they don't go there together. And this is referred to later on or early on in the story, I can't remember exactly, where they often incidentally end up being at the same place, but they don't go together or leave together. So it almost seems as if Lord Henry and his wife live very separate lives, and perhaps it's a marriage of convenience, or they just have kind of grown apart. Later on in the story, we hear some more insights towards the end about their marriage. But perhaps some of Lord Henry's ideas about women he seems quite cynical. Perhaps that's from his personal experience. So Lord Henry says to Dorian, never marry at all. Men marry because they are tired, women because they are curious, and both are disappointed. Okay, now this is in reaction to Dorian's exciting news to Lord Henry that he's met a girl and he's completely in love with her. So you'll see that Henry's got a very sort of cynical view of marriage. Dorian says to Harry, I don't think I'm likely to marry. I'm too much in love. That is one of your aphorisms. And I'm putting it into practice as I do everything that you say. Interesting how Dorian's parroting Lord Henry's sayings back to him and putting them into practice, which is exactly what Lord Henry wants. And of course, we've got this paradox here. I'm too much in love to get married. Now, when Dorian reveals who he's in love with, he blushes. I wonder if it's because he is so much in love at the thought of her, or he blushes because he knows that falling in love with an actress, as Lord Henry says, is a rather commonplace debut. In other words, that's not exactly the best, most impressive start, because as we said in our discussions of the context of the story, somebody who's an actress, particularly Sybil, who's an actress in this kind of very out of the way, dingy theatre that's not well known, wouldn't be the right kind of match for Dorian. Anyway, Dorian says to Lord Henry, well, you wouldn't say that if you saw her. And then he reveals her name is Sybil Vane. Now, the Vane there, there's different spelling of the word vain as in vanity. But I wonder if that isn't also a little hint by the author as to the nature of Dorian's obsession with Sybil, which is based on her physical beauty, not her personality or her character. Okay, we move on to a little bit more information about Harry's views on women. Now, Dorian has described Sybil as a genius. Now, he describes her as a genius in terms of her acting ability. And Henry says no woman is a genius. Women are a decorative sex. In other words, they're just there for arm candy. They never have anything to say, but they say it charmingly. Women represent the triumph of matter over mind, just as men represent the triumph of mind over morals. Very cynical, very controversial thing to say. Dorian responds, Harry, how can you? And he says, that's quite true. I'm analysing women at the present. I find that ultimately there are only two kinds of women, the plain and the coloured. Plain women are useful if you want a respectable reputation, and coloured women are charming, but there's not too many of them around, and most of them, as for conversation, he says only 5 women in London worth talking to, and 2 of them can't be admitted into decent society. So boring, he seems to find women boring, unless, straight-laced moral women are boring. The only ones that are exciting are the ones that you're not really supposed to be hanging out with. And then Dorian says, Harry, your views terrify me. So we're getting slowly starting to get more and more insight into Lord Henry, and I don't think it's incidental that these views, he's expressing them in the same chapter that we meet his wife and are presented with this woman who isn't at all what we expected. And perhaps he's been jaded by his personal experience, or perhaps the other way around. Because of his views, his marriage was jaded from the start. We get quite a lot more information in this chapter about the continuing and perhaps even deepening influence of Lord Henry over Dorian. Now, when Lord Henry asked Dorian how he's met Sybil, he says that it's your fault because it wouldn't have happened if I'd not met you. You filled me with a wild desire to know everything about life. For days after I met you, something seemed to throb in my veins. It's interesting that word throb. It was used in chapter 2 as well, where Dorian was pondering over all this new information Lord Henry had just given him. I used to look at everyone who passed me and wonder with a mad curiosity what sort of lives they led. Some of them fascinated me, others filled me with terror. I remember what you said to me on that wonderful evening when we first dined together about the search for beauty being the real secret of life. And so he has taken on this idea from Lord Henry, and so he was wandering around the streets when he came across the theatre in which Sybil acted and went in and discovered her. Now Dorian describes Sybil as the greatest romance. He has never loved anyone so much, and he's just completely enamored with her. And Lord Henry has kind of brushes Dorian off and laughs. And he says, I'm not laughing at you, but you should not say the greatest romance of your life. You should say the first romance. You will always be love, and you'll always be in love with love. A grand passion is a privilege of people who have nothing to do. It's one of the use of the idle classes of a country. It's interesting how Henry is self-aware that they don't have anything to do except fall in love, or being in love with the idea of love, which is obviously quite a superficial one. Dorian is quite angry and doesn't appreciate being referred to as being so shallow. And Lord Henry says, no, I think your nature is deep. The people who love only once in their lives are shallow people. Faithfulness is to the emotional life what consistency is to the life of intellect, a confession of failure. So he doesn't see the benefit of fidelity and loyalty. Only shallow people are loyal to one person in their entire life, which is a rather dangerous ideal because he's going exactly against what their society would tell them about being married and being faithful. But again, does he really mean this, or is he just saying this to see what kind of reaction he could get out of Dorian at this point by presenting him with all these contradictory, paradoxical ideas and seeing how that plays out in Dorian's relationships. We're going to end this video here and pick up from here in the next one.